Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accused Russia of ignoring US efforts to end the war by bombarding Kyiv just before peace talks are due to reopen. Ukrainian officials say a record number of ballistic missiles targeted the national energy grid. Residents in Kyiv are struggling through one of the coldest winters in years, with temperatures in the capital as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius. The head of NATO, Mark Rutte, is in Kyiv for talks with Zelenskyy, while Russia and Ukraine are due to meet for further negotiations in Abu Dhabi on Wednesday. Now, speaking from the Ukrainian capital, Rutte once again stressed NATO's support for Ukraine in ending the war.
NATO stands with and supports Ukraine, today and in the years to come, not only because we share common values, but because our security is interlinked. We all support your sovereignty, your security, and your pursuit of peace.
And Max Zander is our correspondent in Kyiv. Max, you were at the news conference there with the NATO chief and the Ukrainian president. Did you hear anything new on a possible peace plan and security guarantees from the US?
Yes, Gerhard. So Secretary General Mark Rutte addressed the Ukrainian parliament earlier this morning, the Rada, and spoke to parliamentarians also about the need for robust security guarantees for a deal for the Ukrainians that is better than the failed deals of the past, which is the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk agreement that he mentioned there. And later on during that presser, for the first time, we got a bit of a more concrete idea of what this security agreement could potentially look like. According to the head of NATO, this could be a pre-coordinated military response that should Russia in the future violate a future truce or peace agreement, at the first layer of response would come directly from the Ukrainians, pretty much being the backbone of the security agreement. Then at a later stage, at a second layer, a coalition of the willing would be involved. So countries such as Britain and France and other members, Western allies of Ukraine. And thirdly, as a backbone, as a backstop, this would be the involvement of the United States. Now, no further details were given as to the timing and how this mechanism would be activated, and also what roles the allies would take on, if this would be combat roles or support roles. But this is indeed being discussed at the moment, and the noteworthy also, let's not forget that whatever is discussed, Russia has to agree to the terms of these security agreements.
Now, what are Ukrainians expecting from Rutte's visit today?
Well, I mean, we heard earlier, right? There's a huge attack last night, 450 drones, more than 70 missiles, many of them ballistic or cruise missiles on a ballistic trajectory, which makes it really hard for them to being intercepted. And according to the Ukrainians, the attacks were exclusively targeting the energy infrastructure, so putting people again in a very difficult position here in the capital, but also in many other cities across the country. So hundreds of thousands of people without electricity and without heating, for example. So what NATO can do, what is expected from NATO, essentially what Mark Rutte talked about today also, is that NATO would try to get more capabilities for air defense, essentially PAC missiles, the missiles that are used, interceptor missiles for the Patriot batteries that are needed to shoot down ballistic missiles, for example. So there has been an issue with funding these, with procuring these over the last couple of weeks. They have been running extremely low, but Mark Rutte today promised at that press conference that NATO partners are going to try to even maybe perhaps use some of their own stockpile and transfer them to Ukraine, and then also try to increase production and procurement for Ukraine.
Now, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are due to continue in Abu Dhabi tomorrow. Keeping in mind this massive attack last night and the message that Russia is obviously trying to send, is there any sense of positive expectations for these talks?
Not at all. Not at the moment. And in fact, I believe Mark Rutte at the press conference said that this attack was a quote-unquote very bad signal. So there is no sense that there is really a will for de-escalation. NATO chief, who was usually very diplomatic, was openly questioning if Russia is actually working towards peace. So in the past, during this last round of negotiations, some progress reportedly has been made with the heads of the military talking about technicalities. Now, the big question is what happens with the big sticking points, which is the future of the Donbas region, the future of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And at the moment, it doesn't look like there will be any breakthrough.
Max Zander there reporting from Kyiv. Thank you very much, Max. Now let's go straight to our correspondent, Christiane Mhundwa in Brussels. Christine, aside from what we've just heard, what was Rutte's message to Ukraine?
Gerhard, I think you can sum it up as the NATO Secretary General reassuring the Ukrainians, essentially saying we've still got your back. It doesn't matter what else is going on in the world and where the attention and the focus has been. Ukraine is still a priority. Ukraine's security is still a priority for the NATO alliance. And so that is essentially what the message was. What would have been perhaps newer to a lot of people was the immediate nature with which he said that the allies, that is countries that form the coalition of the willing, would deploy naval land as well as air forces to Ukraine as soon as a ceasefire agreement is reached. He said that would be immediate. So again, all of this in the context of reassuring the Ukrainians at a time when Russian bombardment is at unprecedented levels and the conditions on the front line are really difficult with the winter weather. This was the NATO Secretary General in presence reassuring an ally of its commitment in this fight.
Now, Rutte is often seen as a Trump whisperer. How much influence does he really have when it comes to US security guarantees to Ukraine?
Well, Gerhard, here's the thing. When Mark Rutte was appointed to the job, his key mandate was essentially to keep Donald Trump on board as it pertains to US support for Ukraine. At many times, there were questions of whether Donald Trump would simply walk away from the whole thing. The man himself threatened to do that, just that. And so if one judges Mark Rutte's record on that front, then you can essentially say he's delivered. He's been mocked, for example, when he referred to Donald Trump as daddy. And one would argue this is doing everything that he possibly can to keep the US on board. I have to point that the United States is no longer financially committed in terms of it is not donating weapons to Ukraine anymore, but it is allowing EU countries to buy US weapons and give those to Ukraine. And then there are other aspects that the Americans would be supporting the Ukrainians, intelligence sharing, etc. But I think most crucially is the United States spearheading those peace efforts that is staying in the game as it pertains to trying to bring the conclusion of this war. So, you know, the record is out there and different people have different views about, you know, the way Rutte has been handling Donald Trump. But he would argue he's kept the US on board and Donald Trump engaged in this effort.
Now, in an address to Ukraine's parliament, Mark Rutte said that reaching a peace deal to end Russia's war will require, quote, tough choices. What could those choices be for Ukraine?
Well, if you consider the fact that one of the main sticking points now, as it pertains to negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, remains the question of land, territory. What happens to the territory that the Russians currently occupy in the event of a peace agreement? This is probably what the Secretary General was alluding to. It is a tough thing to expect or to ask the Ukrainians to simply cede that territory to the Russians, for Ukraine's allies as well, who see that as rewarding Russia for this aggression and its invasion. And so that is potentially it. And given the fact that he was speaking to lawmakers, and this will ultimately have to fall into the hands of lawmakers, this decision that is perhaps, you know, preparing the Ukrainians for having to ultimately make that decision, especially if the United States pushes Ukraine in that direction, as it has done in the past.
Our correspondent, Christiane Mhundwa, there, reporting from Brussels. Thank you very much, Christine.
All right, I want to bring in now Jaroslava Barbieri. She's a research fellow at the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. She joins me tonight from Birmingham in the UK. It's good to have you with us. I want to ask you about Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. Many say that he is doing his best to keep the U.S. president interested in Ukraine and on board when it comes to bringing about peace. How successful would you say that Mark Rutte has been so far in doing that?
Good evening. I mean, Mark Rutte has been called the Trump whisperer, right? So in a way, through flattery and good brokering tactic, he has managed to keep the US president on side. And I think a very concrete example of this is the Pearl mechanism, the prioritized requirements Ukraine list, which is a mechanism that allows European NATO member state to purchase American weapons and so continue the flow of military assistance to Ukraine at a time when there is this growing rift in the transatlantic alliance. And so Rutte's attempts to even validate Trump's argument that Europe has not sufficiently taken responsibility for its own defense is a rhetorical tactic to try and keep the US American president on board for as long as possible, with the understanding that the alliance is no longer the kind of value-based alliance. But however, Europe is not yet ready to take responsibility for its own security on its own.
And you know, this is the eve of renewed peace talks between Russia and Ukraine and the U.S. And last night, as we reported at the top of this program, Russia carried out a major attack on Ukraine with hundreds of drones and a record number of ballistic missiles, targeting mainly the country's infrastructure. Mark Rutte called that, and I'm quoting here, a really bad signal. Was that the understatement of the year? I mean, what message there is he trying to send?
Rutte's visit to Kyiv is clearly an effort to signal unity to Ukraine. However, his message is clearly that Russia's maximalist objectives regarding the war in Ukraine have not changed, and the latest attack is really not surprising, is a well-established, well-known tactic by Russia to terrorize the civilian population, to increase its